Is there any tech in particular you believe urgently needs to be monitored and regulated?
Well, I think the big issue right now that everyone's living, and as a parent, I've lived this, is that smartphones are producing higher levels of anxiety and depression among adolescent girls in particular. So we need to take a very long, hard look at that. I'm friends with Tristan Harris, the ethicist who's looking at how to make technology more human-friendly. I think that's front and center for me.
Our next guest called them, quote, a living, breathing crime scene for what happened in the 2016 election. Tristan Harris is a former design ethicist for Google and has been called the closest thing Silicon Valley has to a conscience by The Atlantic magazine. He joins us now here in the studio. Tristan, great to have you here on the show.
This hearing is about persuasive technology. And persuasion is about an invisible asymmetry of power. When I was a kid, I was a magician. And magic teaches you that you can have asymmetric power without the other person realizing it. You can masquerade to have asymmetric power while looking like you have an equal relationship. You say, pick a card, any card, while meanwhile you know exactly how to get that person to pick the card that you want. And essentially what we're experiencing with technology is an increasing asymmetry of power that's been masquerading itself as an equal or contractual relationship where the responsibility is on us.
It is a neutral tool. We hear this all the time, right? That Facebook is totally neutral because you can post whatever you want to post to Facebook. And you're choosing what you want to click. And you choose whether you want to use Snapchat at all. It's just a neutral tool. You choose whether you use it. And what all of this misses is that every time you say that, there's 1,000 engineers on the other side of the screen who have one job, which is to get you to spend as much time as possible. And it's not because they're evil. It's not because they have malicious intents. In fact, I'll tell you, everyone I've ever met in the tech industry genuinely wants to make everyone's life better. But I think there's an elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is this race for attention.
We need to change the incentive. I mean, I think so long as the business model of technology companies is advertising, we are going to have a problem. And that's what we're trying to do with Time Well Spent, is to change the conversation from being about maximizing engagement and time to being about maximizing net positive improvements to people's lives.
What are some examples of apps that people use on a pretty regular basis and the ways that these companies are drawing this in?
Have you noticed if you ever log into Twitter as an example? So there's an extra delay that you don't know how long it's going to take. It's between 2 and 3 seconds. Where the number of new notifications on Twitter you have. So why is that there? Well, it makes that into what's called a variable schedule reward. It's like a slot machine. So you're playing the slot machine, and there's a time delay, and in that time delay, your anticipation's building, and then you get to see how many notifications I get. And so you become more addicted to checking it again the next time.
We are 24 years behind on technology. And I can say that with authority because we got rid of the Office of Technology Assessment in 1995. Think about that timing. I guess they thought they'd invented everything. The next commander-in-chief has to be focused on the true threats of tomorrow. And that's what I will bring to the table as commander-in-chief.
It sounds like there's just a lot of sort of trickery going on here.
I call it the race to the bottom of the brainstem to, get people's attention at all costs. Let's say I'm YouTube and I've got a certain amount of people's attention. What's YouTube's biggest competitor? Probably Facebook. Or take the CEO of Netflix recently said that the biggest competitors to Netflix are probably YouTube, Facebook, and sleep. Meaning sleep. Because at the end of the day, there's a finite amount of time people have. And if you're not getting people's time, someone else, some other app, or some other part of someone's life is going to get it. So these services are in competition with where we would want to spend our time, whether that's our sleep or with our friends. There's this war going on to get as much attention as possible.
So let's walk through why that's happening. In the race for attention, because there's only so much attention, companies have to get more of it by being more and more aggressive. I call it the race to the bottom of the brainstem. So it starts with techniques like pull to refresh. So you pull to refresh your newsfeed. That operates like a slot machine. It has the same kind of addictive qualities that keep people in Las Vegas hooked to the slot machine. Other examples are removing stopping cues. So if I take the bottom out of this glass and I keep refilling the water or the wine, you won't know when to stop drinking. So that's what happens with infinitely scrolling feeds. We naturally remove the stopping cues, and this is what keeps people scrolling. But the race for attention has to get more and more aggressive. And so it's not enough just to get your behavior and predict what will take your behavior. we have to predict how to keep you hooked in a different way. And so it crawled deeper down the brainstem into our social validation. So that was the introduction of likes and followers. How many followers do I have? And that got it was much cheaper to, instead of getting your attention, to get you addicted to getting attention from other people. And this has created the kind of mass narcissism and mass cultural thing that's happening with young people, especially today. And after 2 decades in decline, the mental health of 10 to 14-year-old girls has actually shot up 170% in the last 8 years.
So, how do we fix it? Well, obviously, we just have to turn off our notifications. That should do it. We turn our phones grayscale. That should solve the whole problem. That would be like being in the burning building that is climate change and saying, let's ban straws. So obviously, we need to take seriously, there's a deeper thing that's going on here. We need a systemic solution. And I can't say in front of you tonight that we can just snap our fingers and all go do this one thing and it's all going to happen. Because the real answer is we have to end attention and surveillance capitalism. The pairing of a business model that says the better I am at manipulating in real time your nervous system by knowing something about you that you don't know about yourself and being in a tight individual loop with you, that is the core problem.
And in the race for attention, it's not enough just to get people addicted to attention. The race has to migrate to AI. To who can build a better predictive model of your behavior? And so if you give an example of YouTube. So there you are, you're about to hit play on a YouTube video, and you hit play, and then you think you're going to watch this one video, and then you wake up 2 hours later and say, oh my God, what just happened? And the answer is because you had a supercomputer pointed at your brain. And at the moment you hit play, it wakes up an avatar voodoo doll-like version of you inside of a Google server. And that avatar, based on all the clicks and likes and everything you've ever made, those are like your hair clippings and toenail clippings and nail filings that make the avatar look and act more and more like you. So that inside of a Google server, they can simulate more and more possibilities. If I prick you with this video, if I prick you with this video, how long would you stay? And the business model is simply what maximizes watch time. This leads to the kind of algorithmic extremism that you've pointed out. And this is what's caused 70% of YouTube's traffic now to be driven by recommendations, not by human choice, but by the machines. And it's a race between Facebook's voodoo doll, where you flick your finger, can they predict what to show you next, and Google's voodoo doll. And these are abstract metaphors that apply to the whole tech industry, where it's a race between who can better predict your behavior. Facebook has something called loyalty prediction, where they can actually predict to an advertiser when you're about to become disloyal to a brand. So if you're a mother and you take Pampers diapers, they can tell Pampers, hey, this user is about to become disloyal to this brand. So in other words, they can predict things about us that we don't know about our own selves. And that's a new level of asymmetric power. And we have a name for this asymmetric relationship, which is a fiduciary relationship or a duty of care relationship, the same standard we apply to doctors, to priests, to lawyers. Imagine a world in which priests only make their money by selling access to the confession booth to someone else. Except in this case, Facebook listens to 2 billion people's confessions, has a supercomputer next to them, and is calculating and predicting confessions you're going to make before you know you're going to make them. And that's what's causing all this havoc.
There's a reason why no one is using Bing today. Sorry, Microsoft, it's true. So it's not like breaking up these big tech companies will revive Main Street businesses around the country. And as the parent of 2 young children, I'm particularly concerned about screen use and its effect on our children. Studies clearly show that we're seeing record levels of anxiety and depression coincident with smartphone adoption and social media use. Breaking up the tech companies does nothing to make our kids healthier. What we have to do is we have to home in on the specific problems we're trying to solve and use 21st century solutions for 21st century problems. Using a 20th century antitrust framework will not work. We need new solutions and a new toolkit.
We'll take an example. Cognitive limits. Your brain has 7 plus or minus 2 short-term memory. And when you overwhelm that, we feel that as information overload. When you take the dopamine system and you start playing with that and you overwhelm that, you feel that as addictive use. When you play with our weakness for social validation, that we can helplessly, we cannot not pay attention when our social validation is on the line by others in terms of likes, etc., you get mass narcissism culture. Everyone has to be an influencer. Do I have as many followers as my friend? I have to take that photo down, etc. Confirmation bias, that it feels good at a nervous system level to get information that affirms your worldview, and it feels bad to get information that doesn't. That's how you get fake news. And if you hack into our outrage, you get polarization. And if you hack into our trust, the limits of what we know, the basis of whether or not to trust something, you get deep fakes and bots, the sort of checkmate on your nervous system. So this is a very powerful diagnosis that explains why these seemingly separate problems on the right-hand column are going wrong, but they're all due to this one diagnosis. Now, if you look even deeper, so what do these issues lead to? Well, information overload leads to shortening of attention spans, social isolation, teen depression, suicide, et cetera. Post-truth world where you don't know what to believe, you're overwhelmed. The point is that this is a system of harms, an interconnected system. It's not some, oh, we got to whack-a-mole over here, we got to whack the addiction problem, we got to whack the fake news problem. These are all connected problems, and we have to see it as a system that we call human downgrading, which is the climate change of culture. Because when we can see it as a system, it's sort of like people being obsessed with the coral reefs, or just ocean acidification, or just the whales, instead of saying, oh my God, there's this bigger system that's causing all of these problems. And this is game over if we don't change it. Because it's degrading our sense-making and our choice-making at a moment when we need that the most.
This affects everyone, even if you don't use these products. You still send your kids to a school where other people believing that anti-vaccine conspiracy theories causes impact for your life, or other people voting in your elections. And when Marc Andreessen said in 2011, the quote was, "Software is going to eat the world." And what he meant by that, Marc Andreessen was the founder of Netscape. What he meant by that was that software can do every part of society more efficiently than non-software, right? Because it's just adding efficiencies. And so we're going to allow software to eat up our elections, we're going to allow it to eat up our media, our taxi, our transportation. And the problem was that software was eating the world without taking responsibility for it. We used to have rules and standards around Saturday morning cartoons, and when YouTube gobbles up that part of society, it just takes away all of those protections. I tend to describe this, if you imagine a spectrum on YouTube. On my left side, there's the calm Walter Cronkite section of YouTube. On the right-hand side, there's Crazy Town. UFOs, conspiracy theories, Bigfoot, whatever. And if you take a human being and you could drop them anywhere. You could drop them in the calm section, or you could drop them in Crazy Town. But if I'm YouTube and I want you to watch more, which direction from there am I going to send you? I'm never going to send you to the calm section. I'm always going to send you towards Crazy Town. So now you imagine 2 billion people, like an ant colony of humanity, and it's tilting the playing field towards the crazy stuff. And the specific examples of this, a year ago, a teen girl who looked at a dieting video on YouTube would be recommended anorexia videos because that was the more extreme thing to show the voodoo doll that looked like a teen girl. There's all these voodoo dolls that look like that, and the next thing to show is anorexia. If you looked at a NASA moon landing, it would show flat Earth conspiracy theories, which it recommended hundreds of millions of times before being taken down recently. I wrote down another example. 50% of white nationalists in a Bellingcat study had said that it was YouTube that had red-pilled them. Red-pilling is the term for the opening of the mind. The best predictor of whether you'll believe in a conspiracy theory is whether I can get you to believe in one conspiracy theory. Because one conspiracy sort of opens up the mind and makes you doubt and question things and get really paranoid. And the problem is that YouTube is doing this in mass, and it's created sort of 2 billion personalized Truman shows. Right? Each channel has that radicalizing direction.
Mr. Yang, what would you do about the issue of white supremacist violence?
Well, first we have to designate white supremacist terrorism as domestic terrorism so that the Department of Justice can properly measure it. I talked to an anti-hate activist named Christian Picciolini who told me about how he was radicalized over a 10-year period. He said he was a lonely 14-year-old and that he was reached out to by a hate group, and he wound up joining it for a decade. Now he's out and he's helping convert people out of those hate groups and back into the rest of society. But what he told me was that if anyone had reached out to him when he was that hurt, broken 14-year-old boy, he would have gone with them. He said if it had been a coach, I would have gone with him. If it had been a mentor or teacher, I would have gone with them. But instead it was a hate group. So what we have to do is we have to get into the roots of our communities and create paths forward for men in particular who right now are falling through the cracks. And when you look at gun violence in this country, 96+% of the shooters we're talking about are young boys and young men. We have to, as a country, start finding ways to turn our boys into healthy, strong young men who do not hate, but instead feel like they have paths forward in today's economy.
There's a temptation to say, okay, how can we protect ourselves? And when this conversation shifts into, with my smartphone, not hacking me, you get things like, oh, I'll set my phone to grayscale. Oh, I'll turn off notifications. But what that misses is that you live inside of a social fabric. When we walk outside, my life depends on the quality of other people's thoughts, beliefs, and lives. So if everyone around me believes a conspiracy theory, because YouTube is taking 1.9 billion human animals and tilting the playing field so everyone watches InfoWars. By the way, YouTube has driven 15 billion recommendations of Alex Jones' InfoWars, and that's recommendations and then 2 billion views. If only 1 in 1,000 people believe those 2 billion views, that's still, 2 million?
2 million.
2 million people.
Mathematics is not as strong.
We're philosophers. And so if that's 2 million people, that's still 2 million new conspiracy theorists. So if everyone else is walking around in the world, you don't get to do that. If you say, hey, I'm a kid, I'm a teenager, and I don't want to care about the number of likes I get, so I'm going to stop using Snapchat or Instagram. I don't want to be hacked for my self-worth in terms of likes. I can say I don't want to use those things, but I still live in a social fabric where all my other sexual opportunities, social opportunities, homework, transmission where people talk about that stuff, if they only use Instagram, I have to participate in that social fabric. So I think we have to elevate the conversation from how do I make sure I'm not hacked? It's not just an individual conversation. Yeah. We want society to not be hacked, which goes to the political point and sort of how do we politically mobilize as a group to change the whole industry. You know, we're still stuck, I think of it this way, we're still stuck in a mind-body meat suit. We're not getting out of it. So we better learn how do we use it in a way that brings out the higher angels of our nature and the more reflective parts of ourselves.
To fix this problem, we have to have a different view of human nature. Instead of seeing ourselves as rational choosers, where we choose where we put our attention, we choose what influences us, we have to see ourselves as being the subjects of a big magic trick, that we have minds that have permeable membranes and that people can make us feel obliged to get back to someone else, or they can turn something into a slot machine and we'll feel more addicted. That's just how we work, and that's okay. That's just evolution. So the first is sort of how would we build new models and new design choices based on this view of human nature, and not an idealistic but untrue version of human nature that doesn't exist.
What we're first trying to do is organize the conversation that focuses attention on the right problem, and so we don't get distracted by a million whack-a-moles. Our sort of first step and goal is to organize the conversation and have congruity and coherence around what is the problem and what will it take to solve it. And the problem is the pairing of sort of attention and surveillance capitalism as the business model that externalizes all these problems. And until we deal with that, we're not going to be able to fully deal with all the problems that we're seeing.
The best way we can fight back against big tech companies is to say our data is our property. Right now, our data is worth more than oil. How many of you remember getting your data check in the mail? It got lost, it went to Facebook, Amazon, Google. If we say this is our property and we share in the gains, that's the best way we can balance the scales against the big tech companies.
So first of all, I'm not credible. Everything I have to say, the science is really hard to tell. It's too early to say. Fear, uncertainty, doubt campaign. No, I'm just kidding. These are all the tactics, as you well know. If you don't know the film Merchants of Doubt, it's actually about how, when there is an issue with a company that has produced some product that is of toxic damage to society, the same playbook of fear, uncertainty, doubt gets played with big oil and tobacco and et cetera, et cetera. You know, there's security issues, there's personal attacks on credibility, there's a whole bunch of these kinds of things. What gives me hope, genuinely, is that this is unignorable. It is, people in Silicon Valley don't let their own children tend to use social media. You don't really need to know anything more than that. It's eating at their own conscience every day that this isn't solved. The thing that is the escape valve from that is the excuse, well, it's doing a lot of good. It is doing a lot of good. It can do more good and 1,000 times less of the harm if they change their business model. And that excuse is insufficient. As long as the excuse is enough, then they can keep going. So we have to change the sort of rhetorical mimetic landscape. When you see how this is going, though, the urgency for the election, for children, for democracy, for how this is affecting every country, like this is the most urgent problem that I know, and for me personally, I care most about climate change, and this is the destroying the sense-making, integrating the sense-making that we need for that to come to consensus. So I think this is the problem beneath all other problems, and that's why it's so important.